When Cyberpunk Edgerunners initially released, the community previewed a version of Smasher we hadn't seen in 2077, one that was more akin to the NC boogeyman of the tabletop RPGs, a monster composed of meticulous cutting-edge cyberware as a result of his full-board conversion, topping it all off with the Sandivistan to immediately nullify David's primary crutch. In comparison to 2077's final boss fight, Smasher had no Sandy to be seen and lacked any impressive mobility or combat cyberware, his main attacks being to jump and shoot missiles. Players became increasingly disappointed by the lack of focus on Smasher despite his portrayal in Edgerunners. Well, what if I told you that through the use of modding, not only has Adam Smasher's duel been corrected, but also every boss and enemy contained in 2077. The Enemies of Night City mod has now completely overhauled the combat and enemy gameplay in ways you would never expect from a singular mod. Its initial description is as stated: a complete overhaul of all enemies in the game, including the bosses, new stats, movesets, and animations. Yet it's one of the first mods to implement itself into the game in such a way that it almost becomes necessary for the best Cyberpunk experience. And yes, of course, this includes the infamous Adam Smasher duel. While Smasher was initially a walk in the park for the majority of playthroughs, he now packs a much more intimidating arsenal and combat set. Smasher now has not only a Sandy Mark III, but a Berserk installed as well. Even a Netrunner build won't necessarily help you, as this mod ups his ice and resistance to replicate his appearance in Edgerunners, and what is fitting for a corporate mercenary. Smasher isn't alone in being devastating in these firefights. Bosses such as Oda, Placide, Razor, and any you can think of have been provided with new movesets and abilities to improve their fights, rather than relying on being a bullet sponge to make up for the lack of difficulty. For example, Oda will now have grenades to knock you down, leaving you open for a fatal attack. He'll be immune to smart weapon tracking, he'll have new Mantis Blade movesets, and even new voice lines, a common addition to the bosses, and even some NPCs within this mod. Every single boss will now feel like they can stand on their own and be memorable, beyond their default limitations. Bosses do not stand alone in this overhaul though. The entirety of enemies are now reworked to make 2077's world feel more immersive and detailed, an intricate fashion that we haven't seen before in any mod or obviously the default version of Cyberpunk. It did a pretty good job setting up that basis, but it seems that they just missed the mark when they were pushed to release the game. No longer are you fighting the same enemy with different models. The general concept is each faction, such as the Voodoo Boys or Arasaka, will have their own unique traits and archetypes to overall influence your approach and playstyle in every situation. This is honestly a feature that would have made sense being in the base game. I'm not entirely sure why they wouldn't have added this, but I can also imagine them doing a bit of an overhaul once Phantom Liberty releases, alongside that Police and MaxTac overhaul. No longer are the days of walking through crowds of enemies with a near invincible net-running build. Factions like the Voodoo Boys are going to make you think twice before walking out in the open like a one-man army with your quick axe. All Voodoo Boys now have thick ice, which mean a good majority of your encounters will result in your strongest quick axe being completely useless, while the ones you can use now take more RAM or longer to upload. Luckily though, these new traits are all viewable with your normal scanning, so as long as you pull up that menu before combat, you'll know what you're getting yourself into. One of the more unique abilities I find to be pretty interesting is that Tiger Claws with visible tattoos are now immune to smart tracking weapons. There's a relatively in-depth list for each faction though, so it might take a second to learn them all. Besides specific boss alterations and faction traits, there's an overhaul on the entirety of the enemies contained within 2077. Each enemy you come across will not only be associated with a faction, but also tiers, of which there are 4 quick hack immunities and 3 stagger resistance. Different enemies have different levels of ice to defend against your quick hacks, alongside a possible resistance to stagger, tranquilizer rounds, stun, or even knockdown. Of course, this is all alongside their faction traits. Just like V and now Smasher and the other bosses of 2077, enemies have a variety of abilities. This can range from cyberware such as the Sandy, camouflage, berserk, and improved jumping, or stimulants. Just like we can, some enemies will now be able to combat stim, or even juice themselves to increase their resistances and strength, providing a level of equal footing with V in the field of combat. We all know that Phantom Liberty inches ever closer, and alongside it, 1.7, which will add a complete police and MaxTac overhaul. Well, if you can't wait any longer and want to experience these changes as soon as possible, this mod provides that for you. The first change is actually for us. We are now able to quick hack the police, an exclusion I honestly hadn't even noticed in the base game, which really highlights just how badly the police in MaxTac were underutilized. I also want to insert that I believe Trauma Team were heavily underutilized. If someone could make a mod to add versatility to Trauma Team to where when you shoot a random NPC or shoot an enemy that has Trauma Team coverage, it should trigger a Trauma Team envoy to arrive at your location. I would love to see this, and please, if someone is working on this, let me know. It's been one of my biggest critiques of this game that you don't have Trauma Team on your ass half of the time. Anyways though, police and MaxTac are now a much larger threat if you manage to attract their attention. This mod in all honesty makes MaxTac the end of the line. You should really be avoiding getting to this point, as you'll have your ass handed to you in a matter of seconds if you're not ready. Overall, until Phantom Liberty and the release of 1.7, I have to admit this is the best mod to have installed. If you were per se forced to have one, this should be it. It makes Night City and its factions feel fleshed out and detailed, providing unique scenarios with every encounter rather than some reskins and deja vu every time you approach an NCPD scanner area. Just like always though, I'd like to hear all your opinions down below. Let me know what you think of this mod, and if you'll be testing it out before 1.7 drops. Thanks to all the channel members on screen for the continued support. You guys help to motivate me to produce content that reaches the community to both inform and entertain. I always aim to get better with every video. I hope you all enjoyed, and have a great week, chooms.